Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here, waking up, and hopefully you have your coffee and you'll stay awake for most of it. If not, that's perfectly okay. I'm used to it. My students do that once in a while. Although, usually when they do that, I like to wake them up. I'm really very honored to be here, and I really am greatly appreciative of the invitation to come to Hong Kong for the first time ever. I want to thank the persons who have invited me, Alfredo, the scientific committee, Eva Lau, who's hosted me throughout my visiting professor fellowship here, and everyone who organized this fantastic conference. I've really enjoyed Hong Kong and the conference, and I still have a few more days to enjoy some more of Hong Kong, so I look forward to that. So thank you again. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about one of my main lines of research. As the persons who introduced me mentioned, my area of primary interest is on positive social development in children and adolescents across different cultural groups and communities. Within the United States, I've focused most of my work on Latinos. I am Latino, from Puerto Rico originally, so this work is near and dear to my heart. But also there are many other good reasons to focus on Latinos in the United States. Latinos are the largest ethnic, racial minoritized group in the United States. We continue to grow at an alarming rate in spite of efforts by some people to prevent us from doing that. We're there, we're not going away. We not only immigrate to the US, but we have lots of babies. So. I don't. I only have one daughter, but. So, when I say positive social development, positive social behavioral development, I've chosen to hone in on a particular construct that is actually a pretty broad construct, and those are what we call prosocial behaviors. And prosocial behaviors are not that very difficult to understand because most of us engage in these behaviors all the time, and believe it or not, our children behave in these kinds of behaviors all the time. These are actions that benefit others, and that includes very common, typical kinds of actions like just being kind, being nice to one another, sharing resources, donating behaviors, volunteerism. There's a whole range of prosocial behaviors. Of course, these are the kinds of behaviors that most of us desire to see in other people, right? And so there are many, many functions of prosocial behaviors. There's a biological basis for prosocial behaviors. Of course, we have the capacity to be good. We also have the capacity to be bad. I like to focus on the capacity to be good and try to understand why children and adolescents, why most children and adolescents actually grow up to be very prosocial. Within the broad construct of prosocial behaviors, there is one subset of prosocial behaviors that we call altruistic prosocial behaviors. And altruistic prosocial behaviors are of particular interest to many of us, including scholars, because these are selflessly motivated forms of helping other people. So, as you can imagine, we can all imagine that sometimes we help other people for selfish reasons, because we want to look better, because we want to impress somebody, because we want to elevate our social status in the group. Sometimes we help people because we want to gain their trust and perhaps take advantage of them later on, right? But altruistic prosocial behaviors are really conducted for the primary intention to benefit other people. And oftentimes these behaviors are done at a cost to oneself. It may entail risk to one's life. You know, when we rescue someone, when somebody rescues someone else, or it could be material cost, it could be psychological cost, you know, where someone is deeply committed to taking care of someone who is chronically ill and devotes much of their time and effort and mental energy to trying to help that person. Importantly, these behaviors entail also little or no expectation for any sort of self-reward. Now, whenever I say that, people say, well, when we help, we always do feel good. And yes, that is true. But the question is, did we really engage in those behaviors because we wanted to make ourselves feel good? Or did we engage in those behaviors because we wanted to help somebody? And then the consequence of that is that sometimes we actually feel good about helping them, right? And I would argue that there are many times that, especially when there's a high cost entailed to the self, I don't believe that that is necessarily the most efficient way to make ourselves feel good. We can make ourselves feel good without helping somebody. So why should we care about prosocial behaviors? Well, let's list some of the reasons. First of all, prosocial behaviors, I can't think of a better marker of moral development than prosocial behaviors. They are a form of moral action rather than immoral action. These are the kinds of behaviors that actually can ultimately address and reduce inequities and social injustices that are occurring in our world. And if we think about it, a person who has privilege, wealth, or resources, or influence, in many respects, they would have to engage in altruistic prosocial behaviors if they were to really want to help other people, right? Because if you're in a position of privilege and power and influence, you know, why else would you want to help somebody else? Importantly as well, prosocial behaviors are the foundation for cooperation, for social and global harmony, for fostering harmony in our communities, in our schools, in our workplace. As parents and as members of our communities, we care about these kinds of behaviors. If you were to ask parents what are the desirable characteristics and qualities that they would like to see in their children, I think prosocial characteristics would be at the top or near the top, certainly in the top 3 or 5. They also form the basis for civic engagement and civic action. Turns out that they are also an excellent marker of health and well-being. They're negatively linked to all kinds of negative adjustment indicators, mental health problems, antisocial behaviors, violence, illegal drug use, not social drinking. Prosocial people are very good social drinkers. They're also very strongly linked to all kinds of other markers of health and well-being, such as high levels of self-esteem, high levels of self-efficacy. They're linked, of course, to positive interpersonal relationships. If we think about how is it that children and adolescents, or how is it that we develop new friendships with other people, usually it's because we say something nice to that person. You know, you're dressed very nicely today, Bridget. And hopefully they'll reciprocate and they'll say something nice to you. And over time, you have these prosocial exchanges and interactions, right? And the more of those that you have, usually the better the relationship, the quality of the relationship. That works not only for teacher-student relationships, and not only for work colleagues, but also works in marital relationships and romantic partners. In fact, I always tell my students that if you really want a good marker of the quality of a marital relationship, code for those prosocial interactions between the couple. It's also very much linked to positive physical health. There's some excellent studies, even studies with young children, that show that in randomized clinical trials, when children are randomly assigned to prosocial behavior interventions, they actually demonstrate better health markers, physical health markers, less obesity, lower high blood pressure, C-reactive proteins, less muscle inflammation, all kinds of really nice markers, and many more studies in animal models of those cute little prairie voles. Look them up. They're really furry and cute. Lots of studies with prairie voles. And, of course, this is an education conference, so guess what? It's related to better academic outcomes. There's now a pretty good body of evidence demonstrating that kids who frequently engage early on in high levels of prosocial behaviors tend to do better academically years later. I think I'm going to cover one of those studies later on today. I can't remember right now. but I will. In fact, there's one very interesting study. In fact, one of the studies that caught my attention early on when I started to look at the relations between prosocial behaviors and academic outcomes was a study conducted by John Caprara and his colleagues and Albert Bandura. Maybe we've heard of Albert Bandura. A longitudinal study where they actually demonstrated that early levels of prosocial behaviors predicted better academic outcomes in middle school kids. And actually, it was a better predictor. It was a significant predictor, better than early aggressive behaviors. Very interesting. Not quite sure what to make of that. I think we need more research on that. But of course, being a scientist, I can make up and speculate all kinds of possible reasons. But I will say a couple of things about why I think there might be these significant relations between early prosocial behaviors and later academic outcomes. I think it could work in sort of at least one of two ways. One is that, as I mentioned before, kids who are prosocial develop more positive interpersonal relationships. So maybe they develop more positive relationships with their teachers, and perhaps that engages them more in academics. The other possibility is that prosocial kids tend to have a whole host of really other great markers, well-being, and skills that are associated with better outcomes, such as they show higher levels of executive functioning, self-regulation, all kinds of empathy, and all kinds of other really good social cognitive skills that I believe, and social emotional skills that I believe could also account for the significant relations between early prosocial behaviors and later academic outcomes. This is a line of research that some of my students and I have been kind of following up on and trying to learn more about. Okay. So far I've been talking about prosocial behaviors almost in general, broad terms. I've mentioned altruistic prosocial behaviors. But aside from altruistic prosocial behaviors, there are other forms of specific types of prosocial behaviors. And in fact, in our work, we've sort of presented a model that helps, a heuristic model that helps us to think about these different types of prosocial behaviors. Prosocial behaviors can vary across situations. It can vary across motives, as I said already. It can vary across the lifespans. And so, younger children are capable of engaging in some forms of prosocial behaviors. Adolescents are capable of engaging in other forms of prosocial behaviors that young children are not capable of engaging in. And of course, very importantly, let's not forget culture. In certain cultures, some prosocial behaviors are more normative and more typical and more common and expected than in other cultures. As a starting point, a few months ago, a few years ago, a couple of decades ago maybe, we identified 6 sort of general forms of prosocial behaviors and developed a measure to try to get at these distinct forms of prosocial behaviors. This is not a comprehensive list of prosocial behaviors, and we certainly could have conceptualized prosocial behaviors in a very narrow and much more specific manner, but we really wanted to try to capture some commonalities across some forms of prosocial behaviors. So for example, one form that we measure is what we call dire or crisis or emergency situations, right? Another very important one, I think, especially relevant in educational setting, is compliant. When someone asks for help, like a teacher might ask for help. Emotional is when it's a very emotionally evocative. The cues of distress are overt and very obvious. Anonymous is pretty self-explanatory. Public is one of those forms that we think is actually a selfishly motivated form of helping, where you help in front of others, usually to try to gain their approval. So kids might do this to try to gain the approval of others, or to, again, elevate their social status within the peer group, or maybe gain favors from the teacher, or parents. And then altruistic, which we operationally define as engaging in helping with little or no expectation for self-reward. This measure has been now used in hundreds and hundreds of studies across the world There is, in fact, a Chinese version of the PTM. I was not aware that somebody created that version. It's slightly different from the original PTM, but it seems to be pretty commonly used, especially in studies in mainland China. These 6 forms, some of them are positively interrelated, some of them are not related to each other at all, and some of them are negatively related to each other. And a series of confirmatory factor analyses has demonstrated that each of these 6 are distinct. So even though they are all tapping into some kind of helping behavior, it seems pretty clear from the evidence that's been accumulated so far that there are distinct correlates of each of these types of prosocial behaviors. And I don't really have time to get into some of that, but there's in fact some meta-analyses out there now demonstrating that each of these types are differentially related to different kinds of parenting practices and constructs, and that the gender differences in prosocial behaviors are very different. Some of them, there are no gender differences. Of course, some of them, girls are more prosocial, but there is one where boys are more prosocial than girls. So, of course, it's the public one, but that's minor detail. Okay, so now I'm going to shift a bit more to the substance of my talk. There are many of you that do work on parenting in this room, research on parenting, and I've done some research on parenting, sort of adopting some of the traditional parenting models that exist out there. The most common that most of us are familiar with is the model that posits that parents can be either very warm and supportive, or they can be very controlling, right? They can be engaged in high levels of either psychological or behavioral control, such as monitoring their children or adolescents. There is, of course, the typological approach, first posited by Diana Baumrin, later expanded on by Maccabee and Martin. The different styles of the authoritative, which is usually considered the gold standard, right? The authoritarian, which is a quite interesting style. I'll talk about it a little later because in many of the studies that have been done with white European American heritage kids, it seems to be positively associated with negative outcomes for youth. And then we have the permissive style and the uninvolved, which is clearly the sort of the worst case scenario. The neglect is sometimes referred to as the neglectful parenting style. In the traditional model of parenting, this is a very typical sort of way of thinking about the role of parents. We have parenting over here, and it might influence the child's social cognitive, social emotive tendencies, and in turn, those social cognitive, social emotive tendencies might predict their prosocial moral development outcomes. And then we have all kinds of moderator variables that have to do with demographics and other situational, contextual kinds of variables. There is support for this sort of model in general. This is an example of one study where we showed that high levels of parental support, high levels of peer support actually predicted higher levels of perspective taking, social understanding. That in turn predicted higher levels of sympathy or empathic concern. We could talk about that sometime, but we don't have time. And those things also in turn predict higher levels of prosocial moral reasoning or moral reasoning, how they think about moral dilemmas and resolve moral dilemmas. And then you can see here that moral reasoning is positively associated with altruistic prosocial behaviors, but negatively associated with the public, more selfish forms of prosocial behaviors. And this is a sample of Latino youth in the US. And there are many other studies like this with white European Americans and other cultural samples. Public, it would be, it's helping in front of an audience. So I tend to help others best when others are watching me, that kind of stuff. So I've done these kinds of studies myself, published a few of them, but I've never been satisfied with the work in this area for a few reasons, and these are some of my reasons. First of all, how do we define support? How do we define control? In Latino families, we've done qualitative studies, and the fathers are always saying, well, I actually support my family. I provide for them, I work for them, even though I don't really interact with my kids very often, right? I think everyone can probably imagine that in different cultures, you can define how you provide support in different ways, right? The same thing for control. What is control? What is too controlling? What is too little control? What's high? What's moderate? What's low? You know, in the typology approach, the idea is that the authoritative parent, the gold standard parent style, is supposed to be a parent who is very warm, supportive, and firm and demanding, but not overly firm or demanding, and not too little, right? How do we operationalize what is too little, what is too much, and what is the ideal range? That can vary, right, from situation to situation and from culture to culture. I think because of that, I think that there's limited utility in this sort of approach. I've given talks to parent groups before, and I've said this, I've said my spiel, it's like you should be warm and supportive, and you should be controlling, firm, demanding, but not too much, not too little, blah, blah, blah. And the parents are like, okay, what do I do with that information? So how do we instruct parents to be sufficiently supportive, whatever that means, and not be too controlling? So I think, practices, I think, is much more promising approach for me, because at least we can talk about specific techniques and strategies that parents can implement, right? In the moral development literature, most of the work on practices has focused on disciplining practices, how we discipline our children when they transgress, when they do something wrong. And of course, I think those are important, but I also believe that that's not the only context in which we teach our children to be moral or to be prosocial. And in fact, I believe that the majority of the time, children learn about prosociality and morality when they're not transgressing. Let's hope at least that most of our kids are not transgressing all the time, and therefore, we're disciplining them all the time, right? So what are those other times when we teach our children about morals? I would usually pause and wait for students to respond, but I will make this easier. So, the kinds of TV shows that they watch, the kinds of movies that the parents take them to, the kinds of friends that the parents will let them play with, right? The messages that they hear from the parents when the parents are talking about things that are happening in the world, in this crazy world. They're picking up, we know children absorb everything, right? And so they're picking up on these sorts of things. They learn from their peers, they learn from their teachers, they learn from the books that we read to them or that they read in the school or that they're exposed to. And of course that all-powerful internet world, which who knows what they're exposed to in that internet world, right? The video games that they play with. So I think most of the messages, most of the teaching about surrounding morality occurs outside of those transgressive contexts, or at least I hope so, because otherwise you might need some family therapy. Okay. So what are those messages that are sent to them when they're not transgressing? And then the third sort of concern that I have with the studies on parenting styles, and again, there's more and more research on this, is that there's growing evidence that these so-called typologies are not functioning in the same manner in different cultural groups. And in fact, little foreshadowing, the first studies that demonstrated this culture group difference in relations between parenting and child outcomes was in Asian heritage families. Really excellent work by Ruth Chow back in the 1980s or so, before my time. Not really. Over here, we have parents' use of social rewards when their child does something good. So when your child does something good, do you praise them? Do you show love? Do you show approval? Social rewards. Over here is material rewards. Parents' use of giving their child a gift, something tangible, a material gift or privilege, or, works on me, ice cream. That works. And of course, it's not that parents use one or the other. Most parents use both. So we're talking about relative use of one versus the other. But in general, take my word for it, the use of social rewards actually is associated with higher levels of empathic concern and higher levels of prosocial moral reasoning. And these two things are associated with higher levels of altruistic prosocial behaviors and all these really good care-based and responsive forms of prosocial behaviors. It's actually not associated with public. And in fact, the only thing that is associated with public is the material rewards. That's positively associated with public, and it's directly negatively associated with altruistic. So when parents over-rely on giving their kids material rewards when they do something good, that actually leads them to be more likely to engage in prosocial behaviors only when they expect something in return for themselves, to be much more selfishly motivated. And that makes sense. It's sort of like what you're doing in a sense is you're teaching them to, yes, be prosocial, but only when you expect to get something in return. And definitely not when there's nothing to be gained from helping someone else. Does that make sense? So in this one, I want to demonstrate one of our studies where we showed that, in fact, different kinds of parenting styles seem to be associated with different outcomes. In this case, this is a sample of U.S.-Mexican heritage, the 5th to 12th grade children. And we tested two models separately. One was a model for moms. And so in this model, we showed that mothers who were less involved relative to mothers who were authoritative, that seemed to undermine subsequent prosocial behaviors in 10th grade. And here's one of the studies that might be of interest. Here you can see that prosocial behaviors in 10th grade was positively associated with higher levels of academic self-confidence, efficacy, and that in 12th grade was positively associated with school grades, adolescent reports, as well as teacher reports of school grade. And here also, when they are moderately demanding, that's also negatively associated with prosocial behaviors relative to mothers who are authoritative. So in general, authoritative parenting mothers are better for kids, okay? But look what happens with the fathers. When we looked at the fathers, we found two interesting set of findings. Number one, we did find that the fathers who were less involved relative to fathers who were authoritative were less likely to have kids exhibit prosocial behaviors later on. But with fathers, we also found a style that was not found with mothers. And it's referred to as the no-nonsense style. And this is a style that's actually been found in African American families, and it's akin to tiger parenting in Asian heritage families. So the fathers who exhibit this authoritarian style, which is very demanding, very little warmth, actually it has no effect on their children's prosocial behaviors. And that general relation has been replicated in African American and in Asian heritage families. So this is why I think it's really important that we not just, blanketly apply a typology that's been predominantly based on white European American samples and just say, whoop, this is the way to raise our children in every culture, right? Okay, so let's talk a little more about culture. I like culture. It's complicated, challenging. It's why I don't have that much hair. But sometimes I think I would have made my life so much easier if I just ignored culture. But it is what it is. I can't ignore it. We know that systems produce variations in behaviors that happens within culture groups as well as across culture groups. I hope we can agree with that. Not everybody turns out the same, even when they're exposed to the same environmental stimulus. Cultural members share similar kinds of goals and expectations and norms. And in this case, we're going to talk about the similar kinds of socialization goals. What are the goals? What are the competencies and skills that we as caregivers want to teach our children so that our children have a chance at thriving and being happy and healthy, like all of us? We're happy and healthy. And I'm influenced very heavily by the work of cultural developmental anthropologists such as Charles Super and Sarah Harkness, and the Whitings, and my good colleague Carolyn Pope-Edwards, and others. And they identify the sources of cultural variation, at least 3 sources. One is the physical settings or the social settings of children raised in different ecological niches, right? Or we've all heard that term before. Also, another source of variation is the belief systems, the parental ethnocentric beliefs that caregivers carry with them and try to transmit to their children. Everyone with me? Of course. And then finally, the rituals and the practices, the customs that children are exposed to that also can transmit beliefs and values. How we raise our children, we can see in different cultures there's different beliefs about, when children should go to sleep, whether children should sleep with the parents in the bed, breastfeeding, all kinds of different examples of that. When you're studying ethnic groups, and in particular, when we study Latino populations and minoritized groups in majority societies, we focus on a set of practices that are referred to as ethnic racial socialization practices. And these are practices where the parents are teaching their children about their native heritage. They're trying to promote and make it so that the children retain their ethnic racial heritage. They also might be pre-arming them and preparing them for instances of discrimination, of racism, or prejudice. They also teach them certain cultural group related values. And also very importantly, they're oftentimes really trying to foster and promote a strong sense of ethnic identity, racial identity with their native heritage. For us, it's a big part of our challenge is to try and identify what are those cultural values, what are those cultural mechanisms. And within the Latino populations, a few mechanisms or values have been identified. One of the most researched cultural values is familismo or familism, which has to do with the extent to which you conceptualize yourself as being interconnected to your family unit. It has to do with the sense of the expectation of support to and from the family, and also the sense of duty or obligation to your family. So it's another multi-dimensional construct. When it comes to ethnic identity, that has to do with this sort of the extent to which you integrate your native heritage, values, and beliefs, and all of that as part of your overall sense of self, your self-concept, and also has to do with your affinity or emotional connection to your pride. Sometimes people call it ethnic pride, racial pride. Also, because we're talking about minoritized populations in the US, children can also develop a bicultural identity or multiple cultural identities, whereby they can embrace both majority society sense of self as well as their native sense of self, or they can sort of try and embrace multiple cultural identities. In general, the work on Latino populations has been linked to better educational outcomes, improved mental health, reduced problem behaviors. So it seems to be a cultural strength. These are cultural strength mechanisms. Okay, so this is the model. And I'm running out of time, so I'm going to really quickly go through this. But basically, we acknowledge sort of distal factors that can influence children's development, including the history of immigration of the family, the community of origin, the contextual, the systemic racism that could exist in schools and institutions. Those things, I think, can impact parents' ethnocentric beliefs, expectations, values. And then I think there's sort of that can influence both their practices that they use to teach their children about their ethnicity, as well as their practices that they use to teach their kids about morals. And within that, I think of both explicit practices, things that are intentional and purposeful, as well as things that are much more implicit that might be insinuated in the kinds of movies or TV shows and things like that that they may be encouraged to watch. Those things, I think, in turn can predict the internalization of cultural values and moral values. It can promote their ethnic racial identity and moral traits such as empathy and moral reasoning. And then in the end, those things can predict their moral behaviors. In studies, we have demonstrated evidence of how maternal reports of families and values are predictive of parenting practices aimed at teaching their kids about the importance of family and being prosocial. That's predictive of children's reports of the parents using those practices. And that's predictive of the child's report of their own endorsement of familism. And that, in turn, has been predictive of positive prosocial behaviors. This is all saying the same thing, except longitudinally. Don't have time to get into it. That's all saying the same thing longitudinally. Here, for example, you can see that ethnic socialization predicts their ethnic identity, both from fathers as well as mothers. And these things are really driving the prediction of all kinds of prosocial behaviors. And here, we show a very similar pattern, except in this one, we show that harsh parenting undermines the children's ethnic identity development, and it has direct relations to their prosocial behaviors. So let me conclude. So family and caregivers teach their children about cultural heritage as well as about morals. These ethnic socialization practices seem to promote these cultural assets, cultural strengths, such as stronger ethnic identity, bicultural identity, familism, which enhance positive youth outcomes. And importantly, this is all adopting a very cultural strengths framework and a much more holistic framework where we look at not only the traditional sort of sociocognitive, socioemotive skills and qualities that predict positive outcomes in kids, but we're also looking at these culture-related mechanisms that can help us understand the variations within culture as well as across cultures. And that is it, believe it or not. Thank you so much.
Hi.
Hello.
For those who didn't hear, I said that was great. You can applaud again if you like.
Okay, we're done.
So it's interesting to me that mothers and fathers are treated separately. But there's a part of me that thinks that it's reciprocal and that they influence each other and modulate each other. I wonder if it makes sense to actually ask questions about how they modulate each other in disciplining or sharing values with the kids.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, you're absolutely right. I mean, these studies have all kinds of limitations, and a systems sort of family systems approach, relational systems approach would be much stronger. In some of our studies, we do try, as you saw in the last study, for example, we try to look at unique variants from mothers and fathers simultaneously and account for it simultaneously. But I think, you know, We've published some papers where we use latent profile analyses, and we actually then can look at interactions and moderating relations. And so fathers who exhibit high levels in something and mothers who exhibit high levels, all different kinds of combinations. We have a recent special issue that I guess co-edited with some of my students, where we proposed a multiple socialization sort of framework, so that it's not just looking at the home environment, but it's also looking at extended family, for example, which is very, very important in many many families, period. But also looking at peer influence and how that moderates, and looking at other media influences. So if we can move towards more sophisticated models and more sophisticated analytical approaches, then I believe, or qualitative approaches, then I believe we can start to dive deeper into some of these important interactions that are clearly happening and impacting children's development. So you're absolutely right. I'm glad you don't review my papers, but you're absolutely right. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Gustavo. It was very interesting. So I was just thinking that when I look at your work, is it like an extension to Albert Bandura's work of attachment theory, and a lot of how the attachment pattern was in early years, and how the adult looks like depending on the different attachment patterns that he's described. But it is, when I see, and the things that you've talked about as well in your work, and prosocial behavior. So would you just like to, for me to be able to understand that, how do we, when we say about prosocial behavior, then how do we differentiate between these theories, and how is it an extension, it's different? I would like to just understand how we are trying to, because you did mention about Bandura as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's a big question. So I'm not exactly sure, but I'm going to attempt to give it my best shot. So I think Bandura's theory is very relevant. In fact, I have to say that his social cognitive theory has been quite influential in how I think about children's development in general, but especially moral development. Bandura has a number of mechanisms, such as moral disengagement, that is, I think, very, very important. I've not done myself research on moral disengagement, but that is something that Bandura has talked about, and I do believe it's very relevant and important. I do believe that attachment is very important as well, but attachment, it's not my area of expertise. I think there's something to the idea that developing a secure attachment relationship is important, especially early on. I have skepticism about the idea that, however, that these internal working models are stable and continue to impact children's development. My way of thinking about internal working models is that I think, much like temperament, these are somewhat stable characteristics, but they can be modified by, and are modified by, these other experiences, social experiences, which is why I think, again, I would really hesitate to classify children very early on as being insecure or secure, and then have that sort of stigma attached to these children for years to come. Because, I mean, we're educators, for example, and if we don't believe that we can modify and help children improve and learn, then I'm not sure why we're doing the work that we're doing. And therapists and practitioners are also trying to modify children's developmental trajectories, especially based on their early experiences. I'm really proud of a new study that we just published, just to give you an example, where we assessed early childhood trauma experiences in Mexican heritage kids. And of course, we know that those early trauma experiences are usually linked to all kinds of negative outcomes. but there's this interesting concept in the moral development literature that's called altruism born of suffering. And the idea is that there are some children that even born under extreme adverse circumstances, not only overcome those adverse circumstances, but they go on to actually make significant contributions to their communities and to their societies in very positive ways. And we can probably think of our own examples of those kinds of historical figures that came from poverty or came from very extreme war circumstances or abusive families. And not only, again, did they not turn out to have mental health problems, but they've actually gone on to organize charitable foundations, organizations, and really try to help and contribute to our communities. In this sample of Mexican kids, we found that for girls who reported high levels of trauma in early childhood, for some of them, if they reported high levels of familism, they actually showed increases, positive change in altruistic prosocial behaviors later, 7 years later in adolescence. So it's the first study that I know of to demonstrate post-traumatic moral growth in an ethnic, racial minoritized sample in the US. Very proud of it. For boys, it was interesting. For boys, it wasn't familism that seemed to trigger this increase in altruism, but rather it was boys who frequently used problem-focused coping or active coping. So there was a gender difference in the mechanism that seems to trigger this growth in altruism. I think those kinds of studies, to me, are very powerful because we need to sort of push back against the stigma and the negative stereotypes that all people who are exposed to trauma or all people who are raised in adverse circumstances are destined for maladjustment and for difficulties the rest of their lives. I think we should instead try to focus on these resilience characteristics and these strengths that perhaps we could do more to encourage and promote and foster in our schools and in our communities and in our families and the policy work that we do. So that's why I hesitate to adopt some of these traditional kinds of ways of thinking.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Carlo, for your wonderful speech and presentation. And your work really relates to one of the challenges in many societies younger generations face, that is about the negotiation between their ethnic culture values and majority and minority cultural values. And you rightly highlighted the inculturation of the values, how parents transfer those values to new generations. I'm very much concerned and interested to know more about the policy implications of your work in many multicultural societies. What we see is the policy orientation goes towards the integration of the minority into the majority. Do you think, are we going to undermine the diversity and the rich cultures of the diverse ethnic groups in those multicultural contexts? And what would be your advice for the policymakers, whether it is the right way to move forward to just go with the slogan of integration? Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. You're absolutely right that too often many policies are guided by this idea of assimilating our new migrant populations into majority society. And you know, I'm not a policy expert, so I'll start there, first of all, caveat. I've been taught very well by my mentors to always be cautious. But you know, I'd like to believe that that our communities, our schools, our institutions can allow for space for that diversity to exist, rather than trying to transform any group into a much more homogeneous cultural group. Diversity, I strongly believe, enriches all of our lives, and so I'm always concerned about policies that might be intended to, they believe, to help minoritized populations, as you said, integrate, but much too often what they're doing is, for lack of a better word, is sort of canceling that cultural richness and diversity. You know, in the U.S., we're facing many of these sorts of challenges right now because there's schools that don't allow children to speak any other language except for English. There are schools that are banning all kinds of books on ethnic minority populations or indigenous populations or any of those sorts of things. And those are real threats to these children who really should be encouraged, should be supported in strengthening their ethnic identity. And, you know, when we talk about ethnic racial identity, it's a part of ourself. And in fact, the one very consistent finding in the literature, not even from my studies, so don't take my word for it, is that when Latino children reject their native culture, and when they reject their ethnic native culture, they actually showed the worst outcomes. And as I mentioned, the children who show strong ethnic racial identity do very well, but also the children who show strong bicultural identity do very well. So that tells us that it's not about what culture you embrace. It has to do more with whether or not you reject that part of your sense of who you are. You know, it's like trying to ignore this aspect of yourself that is whether, you know, we're born into, and that is whether we like it or not, part of who we are. And certainly it's part of who we are as people from other cultures look at us. You know, they judge us. You know, so the children and adolescents who try, Latinos for example, who try to force themselves to be accepted by white European American peers, peer groups, sometimes they are banging their heads against a brick wall because usually they're never going to be accepted by that other group. And so that's where I think it can lead to problems for those children. So our schools, our policymakers need to think about ways in which we can reserve space for these multiple cultural spaces. That, I believe, is the ideal situation. Thank you for that question.
Yeah.